Hey everyone, welcome back again. Mr. Denton here. We're going to look at part two of Article 2. Again, we're talking about the president and the executive branch. So we're going to finish that up here today. This one should go pretty quick, although we do need to spend some time on elections again. I know you're probably saying, hey, we just talked about that with Congress, but there are some things that are specific to elections when it comes to the president. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. Along with the vice president, the president is the only representative that is elected to represent every American. Okay, so that is a unique thing, and it's one of the reasons why we put so much focus on the president of the United States. That even though the president is not all powerful and shares power with many other people, we tend to put a lot of focus on the president and see that person as the face of the country. And like I said, this is part of the reason why. Okay, we have presidential elections every 4 years, so we got one this year, and then 2024 and 2028, and so on. I like to think of it this way. Usually, not this year because of some of the circumstances we have here in 2020, but usually you have the Summer Olympics. That every fourth year. Well, that same year we will then have a presidential election in the fall. Presidents serve 4-year terms, and they can only serve 2 terms, okay, or a maximum of 10 years, and that can happen if you have a president who, a vice president who becomes president because the president is assassinated or resigns or whatever. They can serve up to 2 years of that president's term and then still serve 2 more terms on top of that. So they take office on January 20th of the following year. If the election's in November, then they become president in January. That is a really quick turnaround because the president has to fill so many jobs, hire so many new people, and get prepared to take over the most powerful position in the history of the world in just 2 months. But they have teams of people that are there to help them get ready for this stuff and make this transition and make sure they hit the ground running. But why does that happen so quickly? It used to be in March actually when the president took office, but it was just too much time between the election and the new president coming in, where you had a president sitting there who basically had no power whatsoever because everybody knew that person was on their way out. Okay, so they bumped it up for that reason. Most Americans don't understand this next thing here, and that's why we're going to spend some time talking about this. The president is actually elected indirectly by the people. What does that mean? Okay, we all go and vote, but they don't take our votes and throw them into a pile and count them up, and whoever gets the most votes becomes president. Okay, and it actually does not work that way. We have something called the Electoral College, which is kind of this hybrid thing. The founders put something together called the Electoral College, where the American people actually in the early going didn't even vote for the president. The states chose delegates to go, and they showed up at this Electoral College, and how big a state was, that would affect how many delegates that state got to send, and then those people would get together and they would just pick the president. And so it only took a couple decades for that to, people just saw that as extremely undemocratic. And so now we have this system where the Electoral College is still there, but the people of that state get to vote and pick who they think should be president, and then those representatives have to go and cast their ballots for that candidate. Okay? So that happened gradually. By 1824, 18 of the 24 states that existed at the time had people voting, had the public voting, and then eventually it became all of them. All right. So I'll show you here. I'll zoom in on this map, and that's a video that kind of explains Electoral College very quickly. I will definitely include that one for you because that's a pretty important one. You can see how these different states have different amounts of votes in the Electoral College. Currently, we have 20. That's because it's basically numbered off of the number of representatives you have in Congress. So we have 18 people in the House, plus the 2 senators. That gives Illinois 20. Again, the census will impact this. If we get fewer representatives as a result of the census, then those electoral college votes will go down and we'll have less influence in the electoral college. Okay. 48 of the 50 states are winner take all. Okay. And so this is how, things can get pretty confusing sometimes because it doesn't matter if, we'll say Illinois, okay, and we look at 2016. It wouldn't have mattered if Hillary Clinton won Illinois by millions of votes or by 15 votes. She still would have gotten all 20 of those votes in the Electoral College. And that's the same is true for Wisconsin and Michigan and Texas and every other state except for Nebraska and Maine. Now, Nebraska went all Republican anyways, as you can see in 2016. But if you go up to Maine, they split their electoral college votes up. So they have kind of something similar. It's district by district voting. So it's kind of similar to kind of a popular vote type setup. Okay. So that creates some confusion. We'll come back to that here in a little bit. Electors still meet in what is mostly a symbolic vote in December to cast their ballots in this electoral college. Many states have laws that say that those electors they're bound to vote the way that the people of that state tell them to vote. Some don't. And really, this has never become much of a factor. People talk about it in many elections that, hey, some people may go in and vote differently and they may swing the election. They've never come close to actually swinging an election. It doesn't happen very often at all. 435 representatives total, plus 100 senators, plus 3 votes in the Electoral College for Washington, D.C. That totals up to 538 total Electoral College votes. And a candidate has to get 270. That gets them to that total to win the election. If they don't, if nobody gets to that number, then it goes to the House of Representatives and they actually pick the president. Okay, and it would obviously be super crazy if we ever got to that point, but that's not happened in a long time. So you can see the results here from 2016. We may come back to that map here in a second. Okay, so there are issues with this. First of all, people just don't necessarily see it. They still are confused by it. Some people don't even really know much about it at all. Some people think it's very undemocratic. One of the biggest problems is that a winner-take-all system, like we were just talking about, can lead to a minority president. Okay, most recently in 2000 and in 2016. So what does that mean? Well, you can see the map here, and you can see when it comes to the Electoral College, Donald Trump, won the Electoral College vote by, over 70 votes. Okay, and was clearly above that 270 mark. But Hillary Clinton actually had more Americans go and vote for her. Somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 million people more went and voted for Hillary Clinton, cast their ballot for her, but Donald Trump still won the election. So some people see that as kind of, hey, that's sort of undemocratic. And the thing is, it's not the first time that's ever happened. We had it in 2000, George W. Bush, and it's happened in other times farther back in our history as well. Okay. But there are people that say, hey, this is a good thing that we have this, because what it does is it forces presidents to go out people who want to be president, it forces them to go out and win these other areas of the country, and rural areas and places in the middle of the country. Whereas if we just had a straight up popular vote, you can probably guess how that would turn out. Where would all those candidates go? They'd go straight to Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and heavily populated areas, and they would just do everything they could to win those places and to make those places happy, and then everybody else would just get left behind. Would that actually play out that way? People argue that it would. People argue that it wouldn't. We don't know. Okay. Another issue we have is this, because of the setup of our elections with this first past the post. In other words, there's no ranking. There's none of those kinds of things. There's lots of people who have proposed different ideas about how we should do that. But bottom line is we have The first person to get to 270 wins, period. Okay? And what this leads to is a lot of lesser of two evils style voting. In other words, people a lot of times don't like the two candidates that they have in front of them, but political parties have made it such that we have two dominant political parties and they both give us a candidate, and we usually wound up pretty much stuck picking between one of those two people, whether we like them or not. And so people wind up going and not voting for someone that they really like. They go and vote for the person that they hate the least, or whatever. I mean, that's putting it kind of roughly, but in 2016, we had the two most unpopular candidates that we've ever had. Both of them were historically unpopular, and people were stuck picking whoever they didn't like the least. Okay. And so, the thing is if you go and you vote for a third party candidate, because we do have third parties, but they have no backing, they have no money. If you go and vote for someone who's a third party candidate, I would love as a civics teacher to be able to tell you to go and vote your conscience, go vote for someone that you really believe in. But if you vote for someone who has no chance of winning, you're flushing your vote down the toilet, and that's just reality. So that, as a person who's telling you to do what's best to help your vote count as much as possible, I would have to advise you until we get to a place where we have third party candidates that have an actual chance at winning. You can't vote for someone who has no chance to win. It's a wasted vote. And so, but hey, if you've also gotta do your homework, and you got to do what you believe is right. And that's just my take on things. So you just got to keep that in mind, take it with a grain of salt. Okay. States run the election. Again, we've talked about this with Congress, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's decentralized, and I think I mentioned this before. That makes it harder to hack an election because it is so decentralized, and every state does it differently. And it's not online. Okay, but it also means that there's not much quality control from state to state. Some states are incredibly inefficient. Some states are very partisan in how they, hold their elections, or partisanship at least plays a part in those elections. People get disenfranchised. In other words, people lose their right to vote for not legitimate reasons a lot of times. So that's an issue, big issue. Money in politics. We want our elections to be as democratic as possible, but when you have people running around throwing millions and billions of dollars into advertising, into supporting candidates, those candidates are going to be more responsive to people that give them millions of dollars, one way or the other, than they are to someone like you or me. And so then that asks the question, or begs the question, is our democracy more democratic for people who have more money? Is it more democratic for businesses than it is for people like you and me? And so a lot of people think this is, and have thought for a long time, this is a huge, huge issue. There's not really been any major changes that have made it any better in recent years. And a lot of people are very frustrated with that. So it's definitely something that we should be keeping an eye on and trying to minimize as much as we possibly can. Outside interference is another issue. Fake news, and I'm not talking about politicians calling stories that they don't like fake news, which is something that happens a lot anymore. I'm talking about legit fake news that we really didn't have time to get into very much because of the circumstances, but where people are literally making up stories, posting them online, and mostly just trying to get people to click to go to their site so that they can make money off the advertisements. And we've got folks that are over in like Macedonia on the other side of the world that were making up articles, and they're getting shared all over Facebook by Americans, and people believe them, and then they allow those stories to influence them. That's a real thing. In fact, in 2016, studies were done. More people were sharing fake news stories on Facebook in the last 3 or 4 days before the election than were sharing actual legitimate news stories that had sources that were backed up and everything else. That's a major problem. for us, and one that we have not figured out how to deal with yet. Russia definitely got involved in the election. It's up for debate, or depending on who you listen to, how much they're involved and how much they influenced it. But there's no doubt that they did it once, and they're going to try and do it again. And they do it a lot through social media and other means. But that's something to be aware of too, and keeping track of. And so here's one of the biggest things about all this is that maybe fake news and maybe Russia didn't pick the president. But one of the biggest problems with this is that people now have kind of got doubts in their minds about, whether or not our elections were, trustworthy, whether or not they had integrity. And it's not enough for elections to just work. For democracy to believe, Americans have to believe in that democracy. They have to believe in their elections. And if they don't, that's a major problem. That could lead to the end of our democracy and the end of our elections working the way that they're supposed to. Americans got to be able to trust them. That's, again, something that's extremely important. Skip through those there, and the rest of this will go quicker, okay? So there are checks on presidential power. The most obvious one is impeachment. They've got very limited legislative power, and again, they don't make laws, but they can, if they veto a law, Congress can override them. Supreme Court can strike down things the president does when it comes to executive orders and things like that. There are committees in Congress, tons of committees that are overseeing what the president does. It's the only elected office with a term limit. Originally, that was George Washington just saying, hey, I'm going to walk away from this because I don't want the next guy after me to stay as long as they can, and so on, to the point where the president just ends up being in there for life, and the longer they stay there, the more powerful they become. And then after Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, was elected to 4 terms, Congress passed a law that says 2 is it. Okay, and again, the president has that office has the potential to become too powerful if the same person is in there indefinitely. And you can look at Russia with Vladimir Putin. The guy is quote unquote a president, but he's all powerful there. And he's done that over time. The War Powers Act says that presidents can't deploy forces for more than 60 days without a declaration of war or an AUMF from Congress, which is basically less than a declaration of war. A lot of times it's used in circumstances with things like fighting terror and stuff like that. Again, we had an AUMF that authorized military actions and authorization of military force, by the way. And that was passed in the early 2000s after 9/11. And it's been used for basically 20 years now to fight a couple basically endless wars. And so people are asking a lot of questions about that. 25th Amendment has a provision in it. It's kind of little known, but it's become more known during President Trump's term, mostly because you've had some people in his own cabinet that have brought it up and some things like that, news stories that were written about it, where basically the cabinet can, if they declare the president to be unfit, say he's losing his mind or whatever, then they can remove the president and install the vice president or whatever. Highly unlikely that this is ever done. It's super complicated and more difficult probably to pull off than even impeachment would be. Have to be some majorly extreme circumstances, and just, that's probably not going to happen anytime in the near future. So this is an important note at the bottom. Almost every president, you can go back to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was accused every day of being a tyrant. Every president is accused of being a tyrant, either by the opposing side, okay, by the opposing political party and by the people who voted for the other person or whatever. But all the stuff above makes it technically untrue for a president to become a tyrant. A tyrant is someone who has no checks on their power, who basically creates law by speaking. And if you speak out against them, well, then you disappear in the middle of the night or whatever. Okay. The president is not a tyrant, and hopefully never will become one. So that brings us to the cabinet. So we'll close it up here. All right. Again, a couple of these videos I think are really valuable. Do a good job of explaining some things very quickly. The cabinet is basically this. You've got the executive branch, And it's made up of, along with the president, all these different departments. Okay, and each one of those departments has a head. Okay, so you got the vice president that's in the cabinet, but then you also have I think 15 other departments: the State Department, Treasury Department, the Defense Department. Those were the original three members of the cabinet, and then we've added all these other ones over the years as the United States has grown and become more complex. One of the other traditions that George Washington started, and why he's seen as such the father of our country and such an important person, is because of some of the things that he did while he was president. That today we almost consider as kind of like part of the Constitution, but they're not. I mean, they are just um, they're there because George Washington did it, and everybody else followed his example. So one of the things he did was he took all these department heads and made them his advisors, his key advisors, and it's become called the cabinet. Okay, so each head of all these departments become the president's cabinet, his key advisors. And you can see the list there, and a lot of them are also on the list of presidential succession. Okay, why is this so long? Well, this was it's been reorganized a couple of different times. Initially, you had some other folks that were higher up on the list, and then they've done some rearranging to make sure that whoever was next in line to become president, at least the next couple spots. You see these three right here are elected officials. The Secretary of State is the highest unelected official that's on that list. But why is the list so long? Well, this is a Cold War era thing where they basically they wanted to make sure, hey, if we have a nuclear holocaust, we have to be able to retaliate, and the only person that can fire nuclear weapons who can make that call is the president. So we have to make sure that even if the first 20 people on the list are, killed by a nuclear bomb, we'll still have number 21, and they become president instantaneously, and then they can fire back. Okay, and one of the things you may have heard of before is a designated survivor. When we have the State of the Union address, president's in there, his entire cabinet almost, and the Supreme Court and all of Congress, everyone's there. So if we had some massive tragedy, they always pick one member of the cabinet. You never know who it's going to be. It's going to be somebody random, and they stick them in a bunker somewhere so that if a bomb goes off or whatever and everybody's killed, you're going to have that one person to start over the government with, which is obviously a horrifying scenario. They actually made a TV show out of it. It's kind of interesting. They got some good scenarios, presidential scenarios in there that you may find interesting. It's all on Netflix. Got time during quarantine here to watch that. Okay. So close things up here. We've got some individuals, some key members of the president's cabinet. We're not going to go through all of them. But you got vice president there, who is, the most important part of being the vice president is that first bullet. They're the next in line of succession. Their main job, for the most part, is to become president if the president can't be the president anymore. They're the president of the Senate, but that's a largely ceremonial role unless you have a tie vote, a 50-50 vote, then they can break that tie. Happens, but not very often. They preside over the Electoral College vote count. Again, very ceremonial role. And the rest of it is totally up to the president. Okay, in modern times, the vice president has become a very important person because it's such a big job. The president cannot handle everything, and so they have to have people they can trust to take over certain aspects of their administration and oversee certain things. Mike Pence has become the guy that's currently sort of the face of the coronavirus task force. Okay, President Trump is there for a lot of the meetings, and he's there for the press conferences and stuff like that. But Mike Pence was named as the guy who's supposed to be the head of that task force. And like I said, basically every other vice president in modern history has been very involved. But you go all the way back to John Adams, our first vice president. He had nothing to do. He called it the most useless job that's ever been invented, basically. And then over our history, you've had some vice presidents who've been very involved and some who have not been involved at all. It's all up to the president. Okay. Secretary of State is the primary supervisor of foreign policy, so dealing with the rest of the world, basically, other than the president. And the president can't be out all over the world all the time, so the Secretary of State is out doing things like negotiating treaties and just being the face of America to the rest of the world. Um, this is seen as maybe the most powerful cabinet position because it's such an important role because you are they've got so much autonomy. In other words, they're out there they're head of a massive department. They just have more control over what they're doing than any other person. And it's historically been a stepping stone to the presidency, all the way back to our first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, okay, and plenty of others. Um, so they advise the president on foreign policy, on doing things like appointing our representatives in other countries and dismissing those folks and things like that. Again, I already mentioned they negotiate treaties and do other things of that line. And they're fourth in line to the presidency. They're the highest ranked unelected official in the government. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer and chief lawyer of the United States government. Okay, it's important to understand, and this has been a big hot topic during President Trump's administration. This person is not supposed to be the personal lawyer of the president. The president has personal lawyers. They always do. They have people advising them on what they can legally do and what they can't do. And whatever. But if the president gets sued or gets taken to court or is being accused of things, it's not the job of the attorney general to defend the president. They are the head of the Justice Department. They work for the president, just like everybody else in the executive branch does, but they're not there to protect the president or to work necessarily for the president personally and protect them if they do something wrong or anything along those lines. Their job is to lead the Justice Department and get to the bottom of the truth and make sure that justice is served, and that's it. They're supposed to be, the statue of justice, you may have seen it before, I'm sure you have, where they're holding the little weight scales and it's always got a blindfold on. The Justice Department is supposed to be blind in terms of not having allegiances or biases in any direction, just being biased to the law and to carrying out the law and executing the law, and that's it. Okay, so they do have the power to seek the death penalty in federal cases that meet that criteria, hate crimes and crimes against the United States of America and things of that nature. Okay. Seventh in line of succession, that's William Barr. This is his second stint as Attorney General. He was Attorney General back in the 90s. Secretary of Defense heads up the Defense Department. It used to be the Secretary of War up until World War II, and America was kind of trying to get away from that idea of war, and so we changed the name to the Department of Defense. They advise the president on military defense matters. It has to be someone who, it can't be a general. Again, it's another layer of citizenship there. They've got to be a private citizen. They can have been a general in the past, but they have to cease being a general once they take this role. And a lot of times you've got guys that have military backgrounds, but sometimes not. They're responsible for budgeting, for defense contracts, overall strategy, making sure that the branches are working together. They meet with the president on a weekly basis and to make sure that they know what's going on and keeping them just informed on things. Sixth in line to the presidency. Now, tons of other folks in the cabinet, and I have given up on trying to keep all the pictures and everything up to date because, there's always a ton of turnover in any administration, but by any measure, this has been one of the most turbulent administrations that we've had when it comes to people just turnover constantly, new people taking jobs. And, not necessarily trying to be critical, but President Trump, his tagline before he became president of the United States was, "You're fired." He was a reality show host that prided himself on kind of creating chaos and firing people to keep people on their toes or whatever the case may be. That was his catchphrase. And we've had a lot of people come and go. It's been hard to even keep up with just those free cabinet positions that I've given you previously here to even keep the pictures and the names up to date. They're pretty, you can go out and Google the cabinet. You're going to be able to find a list pretty easily. but you're not going to be able to find like a picture of all those people together because it just, I mean, it's hard to keep up. Those folks are all important. They fill super important duties. It's also important to remember that um, they all have to be approved by Congress, okay, by the Senate specifically. So last slide here, I believe, and I know this is went a little bit long, but we'll finish it up here. Um, it's important to know that these other executive officials below, they are not cabinet members. They're key people, and they are very influential and have a lot of responsibility, but they're not recognized as members of the cabinet. And for the most part, they don't have to be approved by the Senate. Okay, so one of them's the chief of staff. He's the highest ranking executive officer within the president's kind of inner circle. They hire staff. They control the president's daily agenda, which is a super important thing. They are in control of who gets to see the president and when. And then also they're there to watch the president's back to make sure that, I mean, there's tons of people that forget the executive branch that even just work in the White House, and a lot of them, they are competitive and aggressive, and they're out, they've got their own agenda a lot of times, so it's up to this person to make sure everybody's rowing in the same direction. Okay. The press secretary is the face of the administration to the press. They're supposed to hold daily press briefings and news conferences. This is one thing that's again been unconventional about President Trump's presidency. He has had a very difficult relationship with the press, at odds almost from day one, and they've kind of ceased to even hold daily press briefings. They've come back somewhat recently because of the coronavirus. They're holding briefings every day because they basically have to. They have to keep the people up to date on what's going on every day. But prior to that, they went close to a year without having a press briefing, which is just unheard of. They still have a press secretary, but they mostly are going on Twitter, and I mean they've had multiple press secretaries over the past 4 years. You got the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who basically leads a group. It's basically leads the group of generals from all the branches to make sure that they are working together and advising the Secretary of Defense and the President on military matters of national security. And then you have the National Security Advisor, which serves as the President's advisor on national security matters. And both those last two positions are there to make sure we have all of these agencies and all these branches of our military, and they're all out doing their own thing. And sometimes they don't talk together the way that they should. In fact, 9/11 is looked back on now, and we see it as a massive failure of communication, of sharing intelligence and making sure that everybody's on the same page. So, we've had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for a long time, but their role has changed and become more intense because of like what happened with 9/11. And National Security Advisor, that office was basically created after 9/11, so that's why that's there. None of the above have to be approved by the Senate, except for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. All right, so there you go. That's Article 2. Sorry that took a little bit longer, just a lot of stuff there. Just again, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.